the first ones, we were told that mobility and social welfare are very different. So a question arises. Should mobility, for example, mobility indices, be a guide to social policy, to public policy in general? We saw a minute ago that equality of opportunity is very important and perhaps could be a link between welfare, mobility, and social policy decisions. I'm very glad to present our first presenter, which is Francisco Ferreira. Francisco Ferreira is a senior advisor in the World Bank Development Research Group, where he oversees the bank research program on poverty, inequality, and agriculture. He has a very distinguished career in the bank, but I want to emphasize that he has been publishing widely on the fields of poverty, inequality, particularly on inequality of opportunity in developing countries. Please, Francisco, come and give your presentation.
Muchas gracias, Rodolfo, y a los organizadores por la invitación. It's a pleasure to be here. It's been a very nice conference so far. It is a bit daunting to try and speak about equality of opportunity after Francois' lecture, but let me try anyway. What I have to say will relate quite a lot both to what Francois said and to Anders' presentation yesterday, which was very, very nice. I called it, like those essay titles you give students, compare and contrast, equality of opportunity and intergenerational mobility. And my talk will be based on two previous works. One is a chapter with Vito Peragine in this Oxford Handbook of Wellbeing and Public Policy, which was published this year, and some earlier joint work with Vito and with Paolo Brunori. So for this conference, I'm going to start very far away from mobility, and then I'm going to come closer and closer. So this is the hope. So I'm going to start with equality of opportunity, give you a very brief mention of the philosophical background, the canonical economic model, which I'll present somewhat differently from Francois, but you'll recognize the similarities. Then issues of measurement of inequality of opportunity. And then from there, I'll come to measuring intergenerational mobility, which is a topic you all know much better than me, but I'll give you my little version and try and show some similarities and do a little bit of comparing and contrasting before moving to some empirical illustrations. So by way of motivation, which is hardly necessary here, I mean, I have some quotes here from FDR in 1937, from Alan Kruger more recently, in which they say things like, we know that equality of individual ability has never existed and never will, but we do insist equality of opportunity must be sought. And in 2012, I think around the time when Kruger had this competition among his staff to name Miles's curve, and they came up with Great Gatsby curve, around that time, said to the Center of American Progress, the rise in inequality in the United States over the last 3 decades has reached a point that inequality in incomes is causing an unhealthy division of opportunities. So people talk about inequality of opportunity in policy, and there's been, I guess, a debate and a literature in economics and in philosophy thinking about whether that concept is just a fuzzy thing or whether it can be defined and measured. So that's a little bit the motivation for thinking about equality of opportunity. And I think the pioneers of this field in economics, John Romer, Dirk van der Geer, Marc Flerbet, started from, when they started thinking about this, they started from this philosophical literature on equality of opportunity. And I mentioned a few of the key papers here, going back to John Rawls, and drawing a parallel with Amartya Sen's work, which James asked Francois about, so we'll revisit that momentarily, briefly. And then Dworkin, Arnson, and Cohen. Now, what these guys are really doing, I mean, at the risk of summarizing a massive body of work in a very small and obviously too simple way, what they were doing was kind of moving the locus, the information basis for assessing social justice, from outcomes, incomes or utilities, to something else. And in my view, what they have in common, these are very different perspectives, but what they have in common is moving a little bit from ultimate choices to choice sets. in that sense capability approach does belong here very much. It's the set of possible functionings that people want to choose from that are in capabilities, or in the work of Arnson and Dworkin, saying that, look, we ought to hold people responsible for the choices they make from within their choice that they inherit, that are determined to them by their circumstances. Their gender, their race, where they were born, their family, the country they live in, whether there was a recession when they exited university, all sorts of things that are beyond their control. So it's moving the locus from individual choices that generate outcomes to the choice sets that's behind this idea. And in fact, in this chapter with Vito, we kind of review the literature a little bit. There is a branch of the inequality of opportunity literature that tries to do exactly what James was asking in his question earlier, which is to do it in a set theoretic kind of way and establish, ways to value individual choice sets, and then ways to measure the dispersion in the distribution of choice sets. People like Barbara and others have worked on that. And that's really is a direct approach at looking at inequality in sets. That's not the approach that has, in the end, kind of become more dominant, I guess, in the literature. And in particular, it is one that has spawned no empirical applications that we're aware of. And so I'll be focusing on this indirect approach. And I'll briefly mention the distinctions between ex ante and ex post in there, but I won't have time to go into detail in that. But the thing about this indirect approach is that it bypasses the difficulties that I think Francois was alluding to when he was answering James's question about capability sets and so on. It avoids those difficulties of trying to measure things that are counterfactual, like, what other opportunities might you have had that you didn't take? This is kind of hard to do empirically. So this approach has bypassed that by focusing on the joint distribution of circumstances and outcomes. And here, it draws on that distinction that people make between factors that are beyond individual control, which Romer called circumstances, and many of us follow him in that, or factors that individuals have some control over, which he calls efforts, right? So the trick in the indirect approach to measuring inequality of opportunity is to look at the joint distribution between some outcome. Francois already said that the measure depends on the outcome you're looking at. So it's one thing for income, another for earnings, another for education, right? So you look at the joint distribution of that and a bunch of things that people don't control, the circumstances, and try to infer something about inequality from that. Notice that looking at that joint distribution is much the same as the informational basis of the mobility literature, where you're looking at the joint distribution of parental income and child income, looking at those margins and at the copula in between them in various ways. All right? So now, this indirect approach to inequality of opportunity has two central principles, which are normative, right? It says the principle of compensation, and somebody in a question already referred to this. The principle of compensation is that outcome differences due to things that people can't control are unfair and should be compensated. And the principle of reward says, actually, there are some inequalities that are okay. Inequalities, outcome differences due to individual responsibility, i.e. due to efforts, are ethically legitimate and need not be compensated for or should be preserved. And there's a lot in the theoretical literature on this, on when these two principles clash, when they don't. They look like they're perfectly consistent, right? You just say, take the things people don't control, compensate them for that, the rest you don't. Actually, it turns out, depending on how you do it, these two principles are impossible to satisfy at the same time. And in another talk or in another event, we could talk about that. We won't have time today. So based on that, people have proposed a number of economic models of equality of opportunity and have used it in the literature to do two main kinds of things. One, to normatively prescribe allocation rules or social orderings. That is to say, if the government wants to maximize something to do with opportunity, then it ought to follow this rule or that rule and so on. And I won't talk about that today, though there's a big literature on it. The other was to draw on it to do something positive rather than normative. That is to assess the extent to which inequality in a society is due to opportunities, is due to differences in circumstances. So I'm going to present what Francois called the canonical model, although I'll do it in a slightly different way, which is somewhat more general, and which Vito and I did in this chapter. And that is to say the key big starting point here is to assume that you can classify the variables, the characteristics associated with individuals in three groups. An outcome of interest, which Romer calls advantage, could be income, for example, which is X here. And then everything else you can divide into two groups. You can divide into circumstances, things you can't control, and effort. And the outcome is some function of those two things, circumstances and effort. Let me to just show you the workhorse matrix here. Let's say that all elements of this vector C, as well as effort, is discrete. I don't need this, but just for what I'm going to use, let's say that they are discrete. So Xij is a function of the circumstances that you have, the type that you're in, and your level of effort. Let's call type all the individuals that have a certain set of circumstances. So a type consists of individuals with identical circumstances. Whereas a trench consists of all individuals with identical effort levels. Let there be n types, m trenches. So then basically the point is you can represent society in a matrix like this, which is, where you have the types on the rows. So these are people with identical circumstances. And then depending on the effort level that they have different outcomes over there. And a trench is people who have the same or a similar level of effort. I don't need at this point to make what Francois, what is called Romer's charity assumption, to which Francois referred earlier, which is the idea that I'm going to treat as effort relative effort, measured by the rank, the percentile of people in their distribution within a type. But I can have that. I don't need it, but I can have it. Associated with this matrix X, there's a matrix P that gives the density function in each cell, and there you've represented society. So you see now how, in some sense, what the philosophers were trying to do, which was to expand the informational basis for the assessment of social justice, has been done. We've moved from a vector of all these axes to a matrix of all these axes. That is to say, in order to formulate an assessment of inequality here, I need not only the vector of x's, but also how they divide across these types and trenches. Okay? So that's the kind of basis for this. Almost every approach to measuring inequality of opportunity can be done with that matrix. But there are many different ways of using it. The direct unfairness approach and the fairness gap approach that Francois mentioned are two ways. You do something different to this matrix and you get to those. And there are other ways in which we've done that. I want to mention very briefly a distinction that's sometimes in the literature between the ex ante and the ex post views of the principle of compensation, which are basically as follows. So ex ante follows largely Van der Gaar, 1993, and it says, what we want to do is eliminate inequality across types before I know anything about effort. So it's ex ante. Before effort realizes, I want to reduce inequality in the rows. So if I'm doing some maximin, for example, I want to take the least privileged type and improve its value, and the value will have to be decided in some way. It could be the mean, or it could be a direct unfairness equivalent, could be a fairness gap equivalent. So you could have many different ways of doing that. But basically, I want to reduce inequality between types before I know anything about effort. That's the ex ante approach. The ex post approach, which is more associated with Romer, is to say, no, after effort is realized, I want to eliminate inequality amongst people exerting the same level of effort. That is to say, I want to reduce inequality within trenches. The two are not the same. Although they may look the same, but they're not the same. Okay. All right. So how do people measure inequality of opportunity then? Well, all these different approaches do one thing, which is a two-step procedure. You should think of measuring inequality of opportunity in the following way. We replace the matrix Xij, which is the total distribution of income, with a counterfactual X tilde Ij, from which you've expurged all the fair inequality. You leave only the unfair inequality in there, and then you apply your measure of inequality, some measure, not the variance of logarithms, I agree with James, but some other measure, a meaningful measure, to that distribution X tilde Ij. So clearly the key thing is how do we eliminate fair inequality and leave only unfair inequality? Now, what Francois showed you earlier, and the things that Anders talked about briefly as well, are basically one version of this, which is to replace each of those xij's with the type mean. So this is part of this ex ante approach in the sense that I'm eliminating all the inequality within types. You see that? There's no inequality within types. Remember that the ex ante approach wants to measure inequality of opportunity by measuring the inequality between types. That's been preserved here, okay? But the inequality within types has been taken away. Ingvild Almas and others have used direct unfairness and fairness gap to do this in a slightly different way. My co-author Vito Peragini and Daniele Cecchi have one in which they do the ex post equivalent. They replace, they eliminate the inequality, or they leave only the inequality within the trenches in some way that respects it more. So there are different ways of doing that, and I won't have time to go into it here today. But the between types approach, which is the decomposition that Francois showed you earlier, is this. You take that matrix, replace each individual with their mean, and then you calculate inequality in it. And of course, the way people have done this approach has generated a lot of empirical applications. I'll show you in a moment some results for 51 countries from 8 papers. But you know what they all do is they go, okay, we go to that matrix, which is what James and his co-authors have called a smooth distribution. I've smoothed it by taking just the mean in the type and eliminating the other differences, right? And I apply some measure of inequality to it. That's the absolute measure Francois talked about, or I can see it in relation to the inequality in the original X matrix. So the X tilde over the X, that would be the inequality of opportunity ratio, or the relative measure. Again, as was already described, these things can be computed either non-parametrically, which is just applying the tile index or whatever you want, the Gini, whatever, to that matrix X tilde, right? Or it can be done parametrically. Parametrically, you must assume a functional form. And that is, of course, something you'd rather not do. So the only reason we sometimes do it parametrically is when the number of types n is so large relative to the sample that you have that within those cells, right, within those cells of circumstances, within each type actually, within each row, you end up having so few people. You know, the females born from parents of this kind in that region and so on, there's so few that precision goes to hell and you can't do much with the non-parametric method anymore. So then we use the parametric method, which is based, as has already been described by both Anders and Francois, on some simple OLS regression, which should be seen not as a causal model at all. So this is not the sort of holy grail that Anders was talking about, a causal structural model of inequality of opportunity, which would be wonderful. This is not that. This is a reduced form of Y on C and E, and E and C. So it's basically trying to get parametric estimates, right, of those conditional means. Remember, non-parametrically, we're taking the inequality in actual means for each type, right? And the regression just gives you, the regression just gives you another estimate of that mean where I've imposed a functional form assumption. So this mu tilde here is just another mean, and I can calculate inequality of opportunity in that way. I mean, just, you know, take the mean of inequality in each type, and if this model is true, the mean of inequality in each type is that, because the mean of epsilon is 0 by construction. Okay? So that's all you're doing. It's a parametric approximation to the non-parametric calculation. In both cases, this is a lower bound. I had a conversation with Anders at breakfast and obviously failed to convince him that it really is a lower bound, but it is. I've proved it in a paper, and that's what it is. It's, of course, not a lower bound on any interpretation of psi. Psi can be biased in any direction. The R squared, this is a lower bound for. Okay? Now, let me go on to the empirics a little bit. This is an illegible table, the point of which is merely to say that these papers have all calculated these things in slightly different ways. So Francois already made that point when he showed the comparisons. Well, you know, some are parametric, some are non-parametric, some use many more types than others. The circumstances are somewhat different, so really shouldn't be comparing these things, and yet I'm, of course, about to compare them. So here are some results from that. This is the 51 countries. The bars are total inequality. The red is the inequality residual. The blue is the level of inequality. And if you want to think of broad range of numbers, the IORs here, which would be, Anders yesterday talked about those R squareds, the square of the correlation coefficient in your intergenerational mobility equations. This is what you should be comparing to IOR here. Now, they are, in this case, not R squareds, but they are, as I said, the ratio of a mean log deviation to the total mean log deviation. So it's very much in the spirit of an R squared. And, they range from 3% in Norway to 40% in Malawi. Now, let me now come closer to the topic of this conference by saying a little bit about measuring intergenerational mobility and then making the comparison. So I think the key thing, obviously, to begin with, which is extremely well known to all of you, is that mobility can mean very different things to different people. I like this taxonomy that Gary Fields, based on his work with F.A. Oak and others, has proposed. You have measures of mobility as movement. Even that can be movement of what? Of the incomes themselves, of shares, of ranks. For incomes, you could have directional or non-directional movement. James talked a little bit about that yesterday. Mobility is time independence or origin independence. So there are all these different concepts. And in this literature that most people, I think, in this room are working on and are exponents of, they typically use the origin independent measure. So that concept over here, either through the correlation coefficient, so the mobility measure would be, say, the complement of the correlation coefficient, or the correlation coefficient, of course, is related to the R squared, right? It's the square root of the R squared. That's great, thanks. Or you can use actually the regression coefficient. So all these IGEs, the intergenerational elasticity we've been looking at, are that beta in that regression there, which is, of course, closely related to rho in the way that was described by the ratio of the variances in the margins, right? So that's well known. So here's what I wanted to come to. So I started from a very different place, right? I started from kind of a philosophical argument, a normative distinction between inequality as cholesterol, as I like to call it. Some very bad inequality that's due to circumstances, and some not so bad inequality that's due to people's efforts. I started from that, but I ended up in a place, when I used the parametric approximation to this, which is very close. It's isomorphic to the literature on IgM. So in intergenerational mobility, obviously there are sibling correlations and there are different things that people do. But one thing that people do, and that we've seen many times in this conference, is this regression here, just the old Galtonian regression of son's income on father's income or daughter's income on mother's income or what have you. And then, one measure you can take of that, you can take the beta, or if you want the margins to be treated equally, you can take rho, which of course is analogous to the R squared, it's square root of the R squared. In this literature, we say, okay, I have a whole bunch of other circumstances here. It's not just parental income. I could have parental income, but I have a lot of other stuff. And I'm interested in the explained share. I could use the variance if I wanted. That would be the R squared. Or I can use the tile or the mean log deviation or whatever. But whatever it is, it's a ratio of explained variance by circumstances to other things. And this is the sense and the intuition in which these measures are lower bound. Is that if I have some omitted circumstance somewhere and I put it in here, it can change the parameters psi on any other circumstances, whichever way. But it will either add nothing or it will add something to the R squared, as we remember from basic econometrics. And in the same way, it will either add something or not to the explained share of the partition. So that's the sense in which it's a lower bound. So let's think momentarily in the few, 4 minutes I have left. Turns out inequality of opportunity, at least in the ex-ante indirect approach that I've described, is actually very close, very isomorphic to the origin-independent measures of intergenerational mobility that most people use. The difference is that we have more circumstances, right? And we deal with omitted variables in this way of treating IOP explicitly as a lower bound measure. I mean, the thing with here, right, is you're not going to treat this beta as a causal parameter either. And I don't think you guys do that in these interpretations, right? Because it can be correlated with all kinds of stuff. It's a measurement. It's a description of that association. Similarly, this is a description of an association, but because we have many things in there, right? We say, well, it's an association between I and Y and a whole bunch of C's, a whole bunch of circumstances. And because I don't observe all of them, it has to be a sort of lower bound measure, right? That's the spirit. You haven't seen this before. The point of putting this here is to show you that, of course, we can do the same thing with the inequality of opportunity measure. So, I showed you that uninteresting graph here just to say these are now the points that I'm going to correlate with a few things, just to show you Miles's graph using the IOR rather than beta, rather than the IGE. So there's a whole bunch of countries. This is the level of inequality of opportunity. So I of X tilde. This is Gini coefficient. The same positive association. You might say, but this is kind of a part of that, right? So you want to do it with the relative. So you can do it with the relative, where this is the ratio of inequality of opportunity to total inequality. And this is the Gini. You still see that very strong association, very analogous to the other curve. Okay, great. We'll make it. We could correlate the two things amongst themselves to see what that looks like. So I could have intergenerational elasticity of income. So this is the beta from, I think actually from a lot of papers by Miles and other people, and the IOR. Notice that they're completely different data sets, right? Completely different ways of constructing this thing. Association of 0.6. Is that just measurement error? Is that different data that we looked at? Or is that different circumstances? These are interesting questions to think about. You could do it with Hertz's intergenerational correlation of education and the IOR. Again, you get about 60% correlation there, highly significant, but not one. And so that leads me to conclude with my last two slides. I think these two, I very much appreciate the spirit of Anders' paper yesterday, that these two literatures don't talk to each other as much as they should. And I feel vaguely embarrassed because I think he and I both said the same thing about 5 or 6 years ago at a conference that Bosch was also at in Chicago. And so we haven't, I guess, made as much progress as we'd like. And I'm certainly one person amongst others to blame for that. But I think we have to keep trying. The commonalities are that, both of these are frequently measured, typically measured as the share in income variation at some point that's accounted for by people's family background. In the IGM case, mostly, if you take the correlation coefficient or the R squared, that's what it is parental income. In our case, it's brother circumstances. Neither approach seeks to identify causal mechanisms. Both are correlation-based measurements. Both benefit from very rich data linking generations, and there's never enough of it. I mean, it was interesting to see David complaining about the scarcity of these things in the US, when to the rest of us, if you work on Brazil or on Africa, as I have done, we just wish we had 50% or 10% of the data you have in the US, but you can never have enough. IGM takes a narrower view of family background, I guess, by focusing on income. We take a broader view of circumstances, then have to struggle with convincing people that exactly what it is that we're estimating. All of that. So I'll end with this, which is a question on which I'd love to hear people in this room who are the leaders in this field. Can anything be gained from combining approaches or comparing results? Or is it just a futile thing because we're doing slightly different things and it just will continue in parallel? I'm not sure. These things, as I've shown you, intergenerational mobility and inequality of opportunity are positively correlated, but the correlation is far from one. As I say, does that fact contain useful information about the extent to which non-income circumstances affect the transmission of economic advantage in different countries? Or is it all due to different measurement errors, different data, and so on? And the challenge, omitted circumstances and their potentially different correlation patterns with parental income and other circumstances, mean that making this comparison within the same study may not be as easy as it might seem. But I leave that as a question. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francisco. And our next presenter is Anna Ludvinek. She's research manager in the Living Conditions and Quality of Life unit of Eurofund. She is currently managing a very large-scale Eurofund's work on intergenerational social mobility and equal opportunities. Please, Anna.
Thank you, and good morning to everyone. And first of all, thank you very much for an invitation to share with you some of our ongoing work that we have started about 2 years ago, and we are about to finish in a few months. So basically what I would like to share with you is preliminary results of the patterns of social mobility in the EU countries, which are based on the quantitative information, and I'll share with you the sources. But also, and I am aware that not many works that were presented yesterday and today, also some information on the barriers and the policies that derived from the qualitative methods. And not going very much into detail about the organization that I work for, but I think something that is very important to remember is that Eurofound, which is an EU agency financed exclusively by the European Commission, is doing only comparative work. So we don't have the resources nor the means to go very much into detail into specific countries, but what we do have means to is do comparative work. And we run 3 surveys, European Working Conditions, European Quality of Life, and European Company Survey, to aid us to monitor trends in social and employment sphere in Europe, but also beyond with the Working Conditions Survey. But we also do a lot of stuff using other surveys, and the social mobility work that we have carried out is based on survey that is done by the European Commission. What I will do in my 20 minutes or so is tell you a little bit about the rationale and the objectives behind the project, what was the motivation, and very importantly, policy relevance for Eurofound to start working in this field that we haven't worked before, and then talking a little bit of our preliminary findings of the patterns, and then moving on to the barriers and the policies. So this is, I think I've mentioned, so I'm not going to talk about that. But very briefly and importantly, we have done a lot of work on job polarization, so monitoring, which I think is related very much with social mobility, so looking and mapping of what type of jobs are being created and are being lost due to the economic and technological progress. And that led us to thinking internally that perhaps we could do something related to social mobility. But when we started to really reflect what is it that we could do that hasn't been done before, and hearing to you also making sure that we're not overlapping or we're not duplicating, we had to really make a very strong case to our board for the funding for this work to continue. So very briefly, Eurofound focuses exclusively on intergenerational social mobility, and as a measurement, and I realized that I was fearing a little bit that I would be the only one talking about occupational mobility, so I was very happy to hear Patricia's presentation yesterday, who also used occupation as a measurement. And the reason, there were really twofold reasons why we decided to do or to use occupational status as our measurement. First of all, we felt that, of course, despite its limitations and shortcomings, it does give you I think, 3 important aspects of economic life, i.e. the income security, but also the short-term and long-term prospects of income. And secondly, because we wanted to cover as many countries as possible, we had to use the data, which is comparative throughout the EU countries. So we used the European Social Survey. I don't know if some of you are familiar with that survey, but it's a survey which I think is fairly underutilized in terms of social mobility, but it has a very rich information in relation to the respondents' occupation, but also to the parents, both fathers and the mothers. So because we set out to cover as many countries as possible, we felt that that was the best instrument for us to go with. We also wanted to carry out our analysis for both fathers and mothers separately, because we felt that many research, especially in occupational social mobility, has been traditionally done between fathers and sons, so we felt that could also be an added value of Eurofound. And in doing so, we were very privileged and lucky to, at the initial stages of our work, to benefit from the advice of some of the people, top experts in occupational social mobility, having on board Goldfrop, Ericsson, Breen, Ganzebone to help us with the occupational classification. So we made sure that the parameters and the approach that we have chosen was sound and robust. And we used the 5 waves of European Social Survey from 2002 to 2010, covering for the absolute mobility 24 countries and for the relative mobility 20 countries. And maybe just to highlight that Eurofound is not strictly an academic organization, so everything that we do has to be very strongly located in the policy discourse and the policy dimension that is happening at the European level. So we had to really link very much with the current policy developments and see whether the social mobility is visible at the EU level. And I think implicitly it has been there for a while, certainly with the Europe 2020, which talks about inclusive growth and equal opportunities. But I think the social mobility has been given really a momentum with the new Commission, which amongst its top priorities placed the issues of fairness and equal opportunities. And you had a lot of figures, important political figures in Europe, very explicitly talking about the fears and the concerns they have about the current generations not having the equal opportunities or chances that they had themselves in the past. And I think a very important development, certainly in the EU, was currently a consultation about the European Pillar of Social Rights, which will be a document which will underpin everything that will happen for the next foreseeable future in the area of social policy and social protection. And the Commission has been, I think, rightly criticized for some time following the crisis, paying a lot of attention to economic and fiscal policies and maybe neglecting a little bit the social policies. So this is an attempt to address that. And then I think very explicitly you had the Juncker, which is the current president of the European Commission, making a State of the Union speech and the challenges to social mobility. And of course, importantly, all these documents that pop up at the European level, they don't operate in a vacuum, but they also are a very true reflection of what's happening at the member state level. So I think we can really see a momentum of social mobility being a topic discussed, even though policymakers very often do not understand or don't know or have a very different understanding what social mobility. And I think the good thing is that even though the EU may have very little competence in some of the policies in relation to social mobility, nevertheless, I think this framework will translate into the national discourse and the national policies that we will see over the next few years. So now I will show you just the first preliminary graphs and the results of the patterns of social mobility. So this is absolute mobility for 24 countries. And this shows the patterns for men in comparison with dominant or the highest class in the household. We have also distinguished between upward and downward, but also horizontal mobility, following very much Richard Breen here, and also indicated the levels of immobility in the member states. And then we're doing the same analysis for women. And in talking to experts or trying to validate the results, we have also heard that perhaps this hides a little bit the superficially high levels of upward mobility, and there were suggestions that we should do the same analysis based on cohorts, with the expectations that the latest cohorts may exhibit much higher levels of downward mobility. So this is something that we are in the process of doing and validating with previous results that have been done. in this area. Even though I must say that the countries that we are particularly interested in, the Central and Eastern European countries, also Baltic countries, and some of the southern countries have not been covered in a comparative research on occupational social mobility. So we are now traveling to those countries for some country missions of trying to understand of what lies behind these results and whether, according to the experts in those countries, they stand. After carrying out this exercise on absolute mobility, which of course takes into account the structural changes that have happened over the years in Europe, we then move to the patterns and the results of the relative mobility, some people calling it Goldthorpe, for example, how fluid or open the societies are. And first of all, we wanted to see whether we can observe a convergence of social fluidity amongst countries. And here, this graph covers 20 countries. We can see that I think up to the generation of born before 1946, up to the generation of baby boomers, there was certainly a convergence. And the lines, if they go down, that means a higher social mobility. But after that moment, I think the picture is very mixed. And also we are trying to understand a little bit what lies behind it. And then after that, we have identified 4 clusters of countries. On the left-hand side, you have the good performance. So we have the countries that have had high levels of social fluidity and social mobility and continue to do so. And here we have Belgium, we have Denmark, we have Finland, we have Netherlands, which seems to be, in our results, a very social fluid and mobile country, and Slovakia, for example. And then on the left-hand side, you have a group of countries where social mobility was increasing up to the second cohort you have there. And then afterwards, due to many factors probably, it has been either stagnating or decreasing. And here we have Austria, we have Bulgaria, we have France, we have Sweden notably, and also to a lesser extent Germany, Spain, and Hungary. And again, we're trying to, there is also a smaller cluster of countries. We have Estonia and Slovenia, where we observe a continuously downward or decrease in social mobility, and then Ireland and Portugal, where the social fluidity has been increasing. And again, as I said, this is rather descriptive mapping. So what we are trying to do now is go a little bit deeper and understand the determinants and the factors that lies behind these patterns. One advice that we have received again is to replicate that analysis based on gender. This is based on the whole population. So at the moment, we're doing the analysis for female and men. And I must say, I was include Miles' Great Gatsby graph in my presentation. But I looked a little bit at Miles' results, and for the countries that are overlapping, you can see a very certain similarities of countries which are open and more closed. So that was really the patterns. And the second part of the exercise we are doing is looking a little bit at the drivers that are very visible in the policy discourse. What are the drivers? What are the main concerns among the stakeholders and the policymakers in the member states? And we used a survey amongst our network of correspondents, which are located in the 28 member states, and we try to see if we see any commonalities or common drivers that are behind the current concerns. And first of all, I think something which I think it's not a surprise, the fact that the term social mobility is very rarely mentioned, and it's not really on the agenda, apart, I think, from several countries, UK, of course, by far a country which is very sensitive, but also Greece. We were a little bit surprised how high on the agenda social mobility is there. The concern about the fairness, which manifests itself in fairly different ways between countries. We have the concerns about the security of pensions, for example, in Italy, and then a very wide concerns in many, many countries about the future of youth, but that I think is exaggerated and very, very high on the agenda in the southern countries, but also in some of the Baltic and southern European countries. The squeezed middle classes and the diminishing role of middle class and the growing number of losers, of people that have been left with the feeling of being losing out, and the possible impact of different types of engagement that has been prevailing in many, many countries, including Hungary, Slovenia, but also Netherlands, Latvia, or Malta. The concerns over what we call in Europe the social cohesion or the regional dimension of social mobility, something which we didn't really pay too much attention at the beginning, and we didn't really realize how huge it is, even in very, very small countries in Europe. But it seems to be a major concern among the Baltic countries, but also some of the Nordic countries. France, notably one of the countries which that has been picked up as a big issue. And finally, in terms of the drivers or some of the topics that have been popping up in the policy discourse was the diminishing role of education and the fact that the education doesn't guarantee you a good job anymore, and the value of qualification, sort of commodification, and the fact that parents trying to, despite policy efforts to make the maybe education more equal, trying quite hard to maintain the advantage in the education system. Now, the second area we looked at was barriers, and of course, when we talk about the policies, you need to understand a little bit, or we wanted to understand a little bit, what are the main challenges and barriers that exists in the different countries to social mobility. And we focus very much on system barriers, something where Eurofound, and we do have expertise, so we looked at the childcare, education, and the labor market. And using then in the report, we then report based on the country clusters what types of barriers are most prevalent in different countries. And in the childcare area, those relate to issues of accessibility and costs. In the education, the very strong notion of tracking and ability grouping. And in the labor market, yes, the access to occupation, but also the issue of transitions of current generation, I think, being constantly lost in transitions. I think you don't have a very typical pattern that maybe the parents or grandparents had of moving very steadily on course to adulthood. I think the transitions are very much protracted in many economic ways, but also in terms of transitions of living independently, owning a house, something that Joe talked about yesterday, which I think is very important. So I think this instability has an impact. And finally, just a very quick scan, because that's something, I'm not sure you can see that very well. Just we looked at the mapping and some policy analysis of the current policies and programs in each of those three areas. So, and then looking what is it that is happening in the different countries in those areas. So in childcare, we see that there is certainly policies to improve access to childcare, which manifest themselves of the right to be enrolled. There are many countries which the childcare still does not exist in Europe. Certainly this is happening in Portugal, or free services in Malta. Another trend which we observe in quite a few countries is mandatory preschooling emerging as a policy in many countries. And here, interestingly, there seems to be quite a lot, not maybe quite a lot, but a resistance among certain countries which do not believe that the mandatory childcare is an option for them to go. In the education field, what we observe, and I don't know if it's an impact of how well Germany has weathered the crisis, but certainly there's more and more countries that are looking towards the VET system, the vocational training, and that is being seen even in the countries which traditionally have not had that, for example, Sweden. But what is related with the vocational training is countries realizing that much more attention needs to be paid to the quality and the recognition of vocational training as a viable and equally prestigious track to the more academic one. And I think a good example here is UK, where the government is trying to push with the vocational training, but you have certainly expectations amongst the society, but definitely amongst the company and business, that this is really something which is not as prestigious and as desirable in terms of education outcomes. There is a very strong movement to pay more attention to tracking or ability grouping and trying to reform that a little bit. But what is coming out from our research, which I find very interesting, is that two countries which seem to be extremely fluid and extremely open are Netherlands and Belgium. And in both of those countries, you have tracking and ability grouping quite firmly established in those member states. So what we're trying to do now is understand a little bit what are the features of the tracking which doesn't pose to be a barrier to social mobility. The quality of teaching comes as a strong feature, and I think there was a couple of papers, for example, linking the quality of teachers in Sweden to a lowering level of social mobility. And I think Sweden has responded quite well in paying more attention to higher standards amongst teachers. And then the second area, which I think within education we see as growing there, is paying a little more attention to parenting skills, or, for example, paying more attention to the beyond school environment and trying to look at it in a more holistic way. And finally, in the labor market, I talked about transitions, and there's a lot of effort in trying to make the transitions a bit smoother, access to occupations. And I think Michelle, in her presentation, talked about yesterday about maybe poorer or more disadvantaged kids not opting for good colleges. And I think there is certainly the case for a more disadvantaged but bright adolescents not applying for good jobs, and I think self-selecting themselves out already at that stage and not trying to join prestigious or elite occupations. And finally, some reflections that we have now trying to wrap up our report and trying to single out a couple of key messages that we would like to leave our policymakers with. So we see that the social background continues to matter, even in the most socially fluid societies in Europe. There has been improvement of fluidity up to a certain point, certain convergence of countries, but that has changed and we have a much more mixed picture. The growing regional dimension and the place of living affecting your life chances, and I think there certainly hasn't been enough attention at the political and policy level and trying to think of some measures to deal with that. And importance of middle classes, and some experts pointing out that perhaps more should be done to look at the impact of the cuts, severe cuts in some member states to public services in which many of the middle classes would work, and how those cuts impacted on the levels of living standards amongst the middle classes. And finally, this is my last slide, trying to also, we are left with some questions that were popping out or keep popping up in each of the discussions that we have in different countries with the experts. Certainly when we talk about occupational social mobility, there is a question, is there a saturation point for upward mobility? You know, have certain countries reached that point that they cannot go any higher? And linked to that, the fact that the higher education doesn't guarantee a good job anymore, so you have this crowding and pushing up at the top. But what you do have, something that is happening apparently in the Netherlands, you have this bottom group which finds it extremely difficult. They feel stuck and they cannot move up. The transitions, And I think the long-term effects on the fabric and maintaining trusts in the society. And finally, which I think many of the speakers have referred to, the difficulties of measurement. And I think here there are 2 points. There was a lot of concerns whether the occupational class and occupational structure is relevant to all countries in Europe, in particular to countries in Central Eastern Europe or Baltic countries, which had this very transition period, and whether that would be relevant. Is there a better measurement? And finally, I think also importantly, the impact and the effect of the fundamental changes in the labor market that are happening, and how that would affect further research on social mobility. We see a huge and enormous growth of the new forms of employment, a growth of temporary contracts, people moving from employment to training to internships, so you do not have a very predictable path, and how would that have an impact on, I imagine, all the different types of measurement in social mobility. And finally, just to tell you, for us, we are now trying to put it all together. And also we are quite limited in the sense that we have to come with a fairly short policy-oriented paper that will be published next year. So we are now also looking for an indication what is it that there are many different findings that we have had found. So we need to be now very selective in what is it that we put in the final report, and come up with strong messages to the policymakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Our last presenter is Juan Garay. He's a medical doctor. He works as head of EU cooperation in Mexico, with special emphasis on analyzing and policy dialogue on social cohesion. He has focused his research on global health and equity. In the last years, he has written a book on that subject. Please, Juan.
So, good morning. I still think we are in morning. I'm very grateful to El Centro de Estudios Espinosa Iglesias. Thank you, Enrique, Rodolfo, all the team for inviting me. I am probably a strange animal in this room because from what I heard today and what I heard of yesterday, I had a colleague coming. This has a very high academic level, scientific level. And I'm more in the cooperation side as a civil servant, trying to implement our programs. But also from my health experience, I went into health equity metrics, and I thought that some of the research I've done on health equity could be interesting to some of the dimensions of social mobility. I won't go, in fact, into EU policies on social mobility. I work in external action, and we don't have a policy on inequality. There's now a working paper. I'm part of the working group, and we're reflecting on that. So with that, let's say, freedom of lack of framework, I wanted to share a few ideas with you that at least, meaning no EU position, on my personal analysis of 30 years of external cooperation, I think are very relevant, and I hope they will be very provocative to you and to the session. I still hope we have some minutes of discussion. So before I go on with that, I wanted to know how many of you are economists? Can you raise your hand? Wow. So how many of you are sociologists, work on social sciences? Yes. And any other type of participant? Lawyer. One or two. Lawyers, okay. Lawyers are clustered on the back. Interesting. Statisticians, probably. But I gathered from my quick statistical eye that some 70 to 80% of you are economists. So I'm happy, because I will be more provocative even, because I will challenge some of the economic, I think, mainstream ideas, which I think are a problem to equity in the world today. The way I titled my presentation, and in fact, when I came, I found out that my presentation was blank, the one I gave in my USB, so I quickly prepared some notes and copied some graphs. But I wanted to talk to you about the ethical margins and purpose of social mobility. It looks like social mobility is good in itself, but I want to reflect on that. I'll start with Plato. Plato in 360 before Christ, he said that the form of law which I should propose would be as follows. In a state desirous of being saved from the greatest of all plagues, here should exist among the citizens neither extreme poverty nor, again, excess of wealth. For both are productive of both these evils. Now the legislator should determine what is to be the limit of poverty or wealth. And I think this is one of our main dilemmas. In mainstream economics or in the dominating West, we tend to accept economic growth with no limits and wealth as signs of success without much criticism. And I want to talk about those limitations which are, I think, important to social cohesion and mobility. The other thing that I would, sorry, this is in Spanish, I'll go back just a moment. The other reference which I wanted to make is what is happening, what is happening this week in Morocco, in Marrakesh, and how we are in terms of exhausting nature and not just climate change. We will have another conference of parties later on next month in Cancun on biodiversity, how we're exhausting nature in different ways and surpassing planetary boundaries is also affecting what you've been talking on intergenerational mobility, but also it is a question on how economic growth, particularly when it exhausts nature beyond sustainability levels, how can that be acceptable without question. Now, sorry this is in Spanish, but I was coordinating the health team in what we call DG Development, which is our policy-making Director General, or Ministry, if you want, in the EU for the external action. And after, I'm a medical doctor, I worked in the 80s and 90s in frontline rural Africa, and being from Europe, I could experience in my own practice the huge differences, the unfair, very clear unfair differences, unfair inequalities, therefore inequities in health in the world. And when I coordinated what we called the EU policy on global health, and that was adopted in 2010, I then took some time off and went to UC Berkeley, where I'm a professor in health equity metrics, and tried to understand what do we all mean by global health, and what we, as different nations or regions, what are our aspirations in terms of health in its wide sense, health and well-being of people. There's no common definition of global health. There is no common commitment across countries on global health. There are very different approaches to, for instance, health as a human rights and human rights commitments overall. And the only common global health objective with some kind of international legal binding is the commitment to the constitutional objective of the World Health Organization, which basically says all countries will strive for the best feasible levels of health for all people. Now, it's interesting that we only have that objective, and it dates back from 1945, before even the Charter of Human Rights. but we've never measured it. So anything that has to do with best health or pursuit of happiness and so on, romantic literature, and it's not measured because we think it can't be measured, so everything remains unaccountable for. But I tried to measure that when I started this combination of my policy work in the EU and my academic activity on global health equity metrics. And why we have never measured how we've progressed on this very only global health objective, best feasible health for all people. Firstly, because we never measured what is the best feasible health. And second, well, we couldn't see how did all countries progress towards that best feasible level of health. Now, and there's yet another thing, I think, in this century we need to add to any policy reflection, which is how not only feasible, but how sustainable is our level of health and well-being for coming generations. So I tried to do that, and I basically missed one slide here with the problem. What I did was, in a very simplistic way, and I'll be very understanding if you criticize me for being very simplistic, but here it goes. I looked at countries that from 1950 till 2013 we had international comparable data. Of course, we can argue how precise and reliable were those data. But based on those international statistics, I looked at countries that had a good health and they had economically feasible models and ecologically sustainable models. And I used three criteria, which were available, and with their limitations, they allow some comparison between countries. One is which countries had life expectancy above world average during all these 70 years. But which of those countries had that good life expectancy but having a GDP per capita, and here comes the first anathema to economists, had GDP per capita below world average. Why? Well, we've always been following models of high-income countries. The OECD Development Aid Committee is basically formed by rich countries. And we follow those development patterns of countries which are enjoying very high levels of income compared to the rest. Now, their economic resources are limited, and those levels of income are not replicable for all countries. We would need 3, 4, 5 planets to have the level of income of high-income countries replicable for all countries. So I looked at feasibility from the economic angle. Of course, there's a lot of work behind on why we used economic and GDP per capita and PPP or other means as a factor of replicability or feasibility. But just bear with me for that simplification. We looked at countries with good health, life expectancy above world average, feasibility, economically replicable models, GDP per capita below world average, and third, a carbon footprint in terms of carbon emissions, the most urgent of our planetary boundaries, below the planetary boundary. So, now we have a problem. Houston, who's helping me now? I hope this can be fixed. But in 60 plus years, we could only find 14 countries that constantly had met the three criteria. They have health, life expectancy constantly above world average, but GDP per capita below. And the carbon emissions, particularly for the last decade, where we have very clear analysis of planetary boundaries, they were ecologically sustainable. Here it goes. So these are the different countries. You will see here the countries with life expectancy below world average. These were countries with life expectancy above world average, but had GDP, above world average, so they could not be economically replicable models. These were countries that, having GDP below world average and a good life expectancy, they had carbon emissions above the planetary boundary. They could not be sustainable models. And these were the countries that met the 3 criteria, but only the top ones met those criteria constantly. Why I tell you? Because what we did very quickly, I'll say, because I want to go into mobility. We, for the first time, we measured the burden of health inequity, which means we had some standards of good health, and we had them disaggregated by age groups, by sex, and by annual average in each 5-year period from 1950 till now, millions of data. And we calculated what was the excess mortality in each country, in each age group and sex during all those periods, in comparison to those minimum standards of those countries that had healthy, replicable, and sustainable models. And it was impressive, because you will see that this is the number of excess mortality, avoidable deaths, one could say, in comparison to those healthy, sustainable, and feasible models. They went down in the 60s, but from the 60s, 70s, the number of avoidable deaths, around 17 million in the world every year, has remained quite constant. Now, this is more precise, because what we did to compare between periods and between countries, we looked at the proportion of all deaths in each age groups, which meant excess mortality from those feasible and sustainable standards. And it is this is a very quick summary, but these are the proportion of in each age group, and they remained around 40%. The red bar here is the total, the average of all age groups. They remained around 40% from the 1970s. And this was the distribution in the world of that, what we call relative burden of health inequity, proportion of deaths which are in excess of feasible and sustainable standards. And we have interactive maps and graphs for every country and age group and so on. But I won't go into that detail of analysis. What we did after was look at different regions and different countries. This is what we see, for instance, in Europe. In Europe, we have these regions. These regions have GDP per capita below the EU average GDP per capita, EU weighted GDP per capita, and they have life expectancy above the European average. And of course, there's not one region, and these are what we call the NUTS2 regions. I'm sure Anna knows them well. Not one region in Europe that has carbon emissions below the planetary boundary, some 2.2 or so metric tons per year. But they have commitments from Paris, and we hope that that is in the making. In any case, from these models, we can, again, estimate at regional level what is the burden of health inequity, the excess mortality, even measured in avoidable deaths, if you want, because of unfair inequities. And this is something easy to understand by people and by politicians. Human, let's say, social injustice or unfair inequalities have a price in lives. And it is really striking to see that this is the burden of health inequity by different patterns, but in some areas, for instance, of southeastern Europe, but also scattered in many other regions, there is a very high burden of health inequity. You're surprised to see regions in southern Germany or in the Midlands in Sweden or in southwest UK, others with loss of life above what is feasible and sustainable, for instance, at the EU level. Now, how to combine this global analysis and this regional analysis like the one in Europe is interesting, because the GDP per capita on purchasing power units, purchasing power parity, was similar to something I'll explain now, similar to an upper threshold, and that's what I want to get to, of the distribution of resources in the world, which would allow everyone to live at least above what I will say now a dignity threshold. So it's interesting this. The more we go into subnational and sub-regional analysis of healthy or well-being and feasible and sustainable models, the more specific we can be, the more sensitive and the more specific if we apply those standards to more disaggregated units in measuring the burden of health inequity. Now, this is, for instance, what I did for the US, for Mexico, and for the EU. We compared what was the excess mortality referred to first, those first standards which I told you, national average of countries which were healthy, feasible, and sustainable. But then I also compared to the national, at subnational level, for instance, among the 3,500 plus counties in the US, which of them have, again, life expectancy above the national average with GDP below, and none of them, I'm afraid, sustainable for the moment. The same for Europe and so on. The best sub-regional, let's say, units we have in the world analyzed so far in terms of healthy, sustainable, and replicable models are those in the Mediterranean, in the EU, in southwest EU. So, of course, by doing that, we have very different levels of sensitivity of the burden of health inequity. And you can see here that, for instance, in the US, and I'll have to give a lecture in Boston on far more disaggregated analysis on US burden of health inequity in a week time, but almost 400,000 deaths a year are in excess of, for instance, the standards of the EU feasible, healthy, and sustainable models, which have, by the way, a GDP per capita some 3 times lower than the average US GDP per capita. In one sentence, there is a very high cost of lives in the US due to unfair inequality. And this is what happens in Mexico. In Mexico, we are now publishing a specific book on the burden of health inequity in Mexico and the distribution by regions and so on. So this is what I wanted to present you after that analysis as a provocative idea for discussion. In a fair society, as Plato said some 2,300 years ago, we need to identify levels of dignity. Measuring poverty, I mean, out of those 17 million people, 17 million, excess mortality due to unfair inequalities, 10 million live out of poverty. 10 million live out of the $2 per day of the Sustainable Development Goal 1. So poverty is not enough to ensure a dignified life, a life at least in access to a quantity of life expectancy which could be feasible for all people. So we call this dignity threshold, and it's much higher. It's like 8 times higher the poverty threshold of SDGs. This is the average PPP in the world. Now, if you have a minimum and you have an average, and this is the question, shouldn't we think of a maximum, of an excess threshold? And this is what Plato suggested 2,300 years ago. And it looks like in the West, we've been blessing the excess, the success measured in excess accumulation. But there's a limit to that, right? And the 3 limits of having excess accumulation are, one, and this is, I'll say this very quickly because I believe I only have 4 minutes left. One is that there is an indirect relation of accumulating excess wealth with those many, which is around 40% of the world's population, living under this dignity threshold, below which no country in 70 years has been able to have a national average life expectancy which could be feasible for all people. You see my argument. So there is an indirect relation of excess accumulation and loss of life of those that live under the minimum dignity. The second argument is that there is a correlation between that excess accumulation, having GDPs much higher than that, and exhausting nature. There's a very, very strong correlation. And I was reading today that the subsidies to the oil-related economy are over 300 trillion a year. And this is 3 times ODA, and it's more than twice the subsidies to renewable energies. We live in an economy so far where there's a very high correlation with excess accumulation, excess production and consumption, and exhaustion of nature. But the third and most striking question to excess accumulation is that beyond this excess threshold, life expectancy, but many other indicators of well-being do not improve. I don't know if you're familiar with the book of Wilkinson and Pickett on the spirit level. They analyzed over 50 well-being indicators, and they said beyond a certain level, we just accumulate, but not for even our own good. And we see that in the EU. In the EU, the healthy life expectancy in the last 5 years has not increased. In fact, on average, has slightly decreased, despite GDP, and this is even beyond before the crisis, despite increased GDP per capita and increased health spending. Now, so that would be, this is something to consider. A fair society would, like Plato said, would probably need to limit a minimum income, a maximum around an average. And now I'll go very quickly to the last slide. It's interesting that in that global distribution of resources, that equity curve could well accommodate GDP per capita levels here of the ones of regions like Southwest Europe, which have the highest life expectancies in the world, with Japan and others. So we could have very good life, but limiting the excess and ensuring the minimum. So, and this is 10 seconds for this one, please, because it took me a month, and it's around these equity curves of population and people in blue, population in yellow. This is a theoretical equity curve under which there would be enough resources for everyone, and everyone would be on average in his or her country having a life expectancy which could be feasible and sustainable for all. Now, this is what it would be, but here is the population in the world. Of course, there are peaks here because of China, India, but there's a disaggregation by big countries. This is the distribution of the world's population in relation to the equity curve, and in yellow is the distribution of resources. So there is a disconnect between resources and people, and there's a disconnect between both and the equity curve. I won't go into those details. There are thousands of analyses and graphs on that, but we don't have the time. And what would be the redistribution modalities and towards symmetrical equity curves in theory, or at least biased, skewed equity curves, but accommodating everyone within those resources for a feasible life, for a dignified life. I won't go into the relations between Gini and those different redistribution models. In fact, for that equity curve, we wouldn't have resources, enough resources for all. And there's a whole debate on the growth, particularly on the relation with let's say, heated economies. And there's a whole area of studies now on the subnational inequalities and inequities, as this picture reflects. This is what we've seen in Mexico, and these are the distributions between regions in Mexico. These are states, and these are the 2,400 municipalities, and how many of them are under the equity curve or above or below, and how that links to something that Anna said, territorial cohesion, how important that is on regions that have to be in solidarity because they can have excess after accommodating each municipality within the equity curve, and those which are in need in countries like Mexico. So there's a very good analysis of linking all this, let's say, access to life expectancy and well-being and territorial cohesion. And in fact, this is similar to what we have in the EU as a target, which is 60% of the median as a trigger for territorial cohesion. It ends up being quite similar, but with this evidence. My last slide is this one. A fair society, in my opinion, needs to accommodate all citizens between the between the dignity threshold and the excess threshold. And it's not me, it's Plato who said that 2,300 years ago. And the other, as I said in my title, the other ethical margins, if you want, of equity is the planetary boundary. What is the average of resources and the distribution of them in relation to our planetary boundary? And the mobility needs to be, in my opinion, and this is with my very limited capacity in comparison to yours, mobility also has to have one very important dimension, probably very difficult to measure. How do we reward mobility in relation to the contribution to common good? Mobility could be great, and using the best of your opportunities for GDP would be great. But if you use that, for instance, to speculate with the economy or to, I don't know, to do anything which is not really good and sometimes harmful to society, then probably that should be questioned. So I had different models here, but I won't go into that. But I believe these four elements summarize what I wanted to say: the ethical margins and purpose of social mobility. I hope that contributed to some of your thoughts and debates now and later. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Juan. We have very little time, and just I'm going to allow just one round of questions, perhaps 3 questions, short ones, and we begin with James.
Hello. Chico, your approach risks cutoffs between effort. I wonder if you have results that talk about the robustness of the various figures you put there with respect to changing cutoffs. I hope I'm clear about that. Also, your assumption that you can separate circumstances and effort variables is, of course, never valid. I'm wondering what work is there that is dealing with that problem. And perhaps the prioritization of what we should attack if we're trying to help inequality of opportunity. The second speaker, Anna, I was having a question on how middle classes are measured, what it means in the EU. I'm quite interested in that topic and would just want that factual response. And Dr. Garay, many times in measuring multidimensional poverty, countries are trying to include a dimension of social cohesion. I wonder how you suggest social cohesion to be measured. And then secondly, most of your discussion mentioned GDP. But as we mentioned before, wealth seems rather important as well, since it's direct link to human capital and wealth. So if you would just discuss that, that'd be great. Thanks.
We have now 3 questions, but we can allow someone else. Someone in the back.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Dr. Garay, while I agree with your assessment and I find it very interesting, my question is, I don't think it's not the task of the economists. I mean, when you have achieved certain level of what you call the threshold of dignity, then you have to be open to other kinds of goods that are not material, like intellectual goods, like reading and listen to music. And I don't think the economists, I mean, I don't want to offend them because they are the majority in the room, but I don't think they are prepared to provide these goods. I mean, at that point, it has to be the task of other professionals who are prepared to this kind of education. And in that sense, it's kind of weird. I mean, yesterday when we talked about the distribution of professions, it was like a bad news that many people go to education instead of, I don't know, lawyers and doctors and everything. But one would say, well, it's important in order to have this kind of sustainable growth to be open to other kind of goods that are not so expensive and are of a different nature. And what would you say, which kind of professionals would have to fill this gap?
Thank you. Last question, perhaps a philosopher? Another philosopher? Let's close here, and I give you the floor to answer in the same order.
So there were also 3 questions, just in the question from James to me. But let me start with the one on separability between circumstances and efforts. So I didn't go into it here, although I think Anders did talk about it a little bit. We don't actually make an assumption that circumstances and efforts are separable at all. The identifying assumption, if you like, because we are identifying something, which is the lower bound joint effect of circumstances on outcomes, is that circumstances are not affected by efforts. So circumstances are exogenous. Right? So the structural model you should think of is Y is a function of C and E is a function of C. So we fully allow for the fact that your parental education affects your efforts. That when you study harder because your parents inculcated something on you, that's perfectly allowed, right? That's in there. So it's only that efforts don't affect circumstances. So the structural model goes Y is a function of C and E is a function of C. The reduced form of that is Y as a function of C. So the parameters psi, if you like, are capturing 2 things. They're capturing the direct effect of circumstances as well as the effect of circumstances on efforts. And that's all fine. The only thing you need is that circumstances are not affected by effort. So your race is not affected by how hard you study. Your gender is not affected by how hard you work, that sort of thing. On the cutoffs, I imagine you're talking about the partition between circumstances and so on and so forth. And it is, of course, quite sensitive to that, the numbers you'd get overall. There is an approach by Elbers, Mistian, Leniau, and Osler to these decompositions, which try to control for the number of elements in the partition. Maybe you know that paper. If not, we can talk about it a little bit. But the way we do it, it is sensitive to how fine the partition is. I think too long for before lunch, since we're already after time, but we can talk about that later, maybe.
Thank you. Very quickly. That's a very good question, and it's something that we are looking a little bit more. The middle classes emerged in our policy discourse analysis, and then what we try to do now is actually look how the middle classes are defined in the member states. So you have this sort of self-identification. So there are a number of questions in different surveys, which class do you belong to? And then we try to compare that to some of the definition based on income and then occupational classes, and how we do collapse the 7, I think, classes into 3, the working, middle, upper. But maybe we could talk a little bit later in the break.
And thanks for the very difficult question. I think you deserve the book, or you can discuss it together. The one is on multidimensional poverty, and Mexico is championing that analysis. My problem with multidimensional poverty is that it's absolute poverty still, with different dimensions. So it's not relative poverty, and it doesn't move with time. I have a very interesting video I will share with you on how that equity curve moves along time, and if you, of course, have a fixed threshold of poverty that is only updated every 7, 10 years or whatever, there is a gap between the reality of people and the way we classify them. On wealth, definitely, and I refer a lot to the work of Thomas Piketty on how particularly the accumulation of wealth of the not upper quintile, upper 1%, has a huge distortion on equity, and very clearly so. But I didn't have the data, and this was just, as I said, very simplistic analysis that I can complement. Now, social cohesion, there are thousands of definitions, and I don't even like the word itself, because social cohesion doesn't imply mobility inside, right? It's like a physical cohesion definition. So I like to think of that last this very simple curve that I showed. Social cohesion means this fair distribution of resources and opportunities. I'll come back to the last question now, which allows people to fulfill the potential of contributing to common good, in fact, which is seen by many sociologists as the main source of happiness. But in order to do that, and we have, for instance, a huge challenge in Mexico, where the level of trust between people and with institutions is so low that the empathy and the information to really have a free choice of actions towards common good is really, really low. So social cohesion, to me, that graph represents, and in my understanding, the level of empathy and information that allows people and trust to strive to contribute to common good is at the heart of a fair society, which we could label as social cohesive. Now, intellectual, I'd love to talk with you now bilaterally. I don't think we have much time. I think economists should think of the excess threshold and how endless economic growth can be questionable or not. I think the time is over because they cut me off. But I do think that we need a new science, or if you want equitists or equifields or equidogs or whatever, that combines, one, a kind of a legal background on universal rights, which in the last 30 years have been neglected in a binding way at the international level, and I fear we are entering even more dangerous times. Second, a new knowledge society which, through education, communication, and values, boosts or encourages that contribution to common good, which is not dominating our societies, economic equity, and ecology. Let's not forget that. So many disciplines towards a sustainable equity, which are not yet clustered in a very defined traditional training profession. Thanks.
Thank you, and thank you very much to our panel. There will be an announcement.
Yes, we're going to take a 10-minute break. The organizers tell me that we have to leave the room. There's going to be some changes in the tables. You can leave all your things here, but if I ask you, please, we have to leave the room completely, just for a few minutes, right? Just 10 minutes, and we start again because we are behind. Session 5 will be about civil society. In 10 minutes we start. Thank you.